So the resources that we can use when we get announced that we have an FDA inspection are basically, the FDA compliance program guidance that's online. We will have some PI questions that Jill created at the end of our presentation. And of course, we have the FDA regulated research oversight program within UW with notification of the FDA inspection external audit policies, FDA inspection intake form, and FDA inspection guidance. Next. Now, the timing of the inspection, you can imagine this is nerve-wracking, very stressful if you have not gone through an FDA audit. But the most important thing is the preparation, and you do not need to be stressed out or going crazy about an FDA inspection. The important thing about preparing for an inspection is I truly believe that the preparation should be way long before when we start doing the studies, not when we get announced for the inspection. So I like to be proactive, not reactive. And by being proactive, I like to include if we have any part in protocol development into incorporating quality management, quality assurance, quality control within the study protocol and with our source documents, our checklist and everything, and hopefully manage the study like if we knew that we were going to get an FDA inspection sometime in the future. I've had PIs that have presented NDAs and they already know the FDA is going to come out, and they have an easy way of doing the trial. They apply good clinical practice from the beginning. They don't stress out when they get the FDA notice because they already knew it. So if we take every trial that we participate in, conduct or manage, as they will be inspected by the FDA and following good clinical practice, we should be prepared long before we get that notification. Next slide. So the intake documents, it's important to understand that the FDA might call us in as an email or some type of form of notifying us about an inspection. What type of inspections can we really face? We could have an inspection that is for routine inspection. That's basically to verify data accuracy that's supporting an NDA in the research. It could be a compliance follow-up. This normally occurs once the FDA has been already out to our site and we have significant issues on a 483 observation or a warning letter. They will come back out to make sure that we have fixed those issues, and that's called the compliance follow-up inspection. A for-cause inspection usually is a specific problem that has been reported to the FDA. It could be reported by a patient, by the sponsor, or by the community. So what happens when we get a notification of a 42 or that we're having an inspection? We have to get the dates from the FDA, anticipate the duration of the audit, the inspector contact. We have to get all the information that we can from that first initial phone call. We need to understand what is being inspected. The who is basically the PI. So what trials are they requesting? We should not make their job a lot easier. They know what to do. We should not make their job easier by offering suggestions or asking them about other studies or other doctors. Why is the inspection being done? This is very important. Is it just a routine or is it a for-cause audit? We need to understand that. Whether the inspector wants specific personnel available during the visit and whom. And we'll see in the next slide when we contact and who to contact about that. And whether the inspector wants specific directors available during the visit and which ones they want. Again, we don't give them suggestions. We wait for them to let us know. And if they have a patient list or something that they want to inspect. Next slide. So who do we notify when we have an inspection? Of course, if the study team becomes aware or the PI, the first people that we have to notify is within our department, supervisors, directors, and all that. At the same time, contacting the FDA regulated research oversight program, and the email is there on the slide. So what do we notify them and what do we have in the email when we write to the regulated research oversight program is all the information from the previous page, the name of the inspector, the cause of the audit, who's going to be on the FDA exit interview, and so forth. We also should notify the sponsor. A lot of sponsors, especially if it's pharmaceutical sponsored research, the sponsor will send out monitors or auditors to help us prepare for the FDA inspection and make sure that all their data and monitoring reports are available. We should notify ancillary services, pharmacies, because they might want to see drug accountability, the product, where it's located, how it's dispensed, laboratories, sometimes where we contain or save samples, things like that. Of course, the IRB, there might be questions regarding the IRB. Individuals near the room that we reserve for the inspector should be notified of the inspection going on, so they can't, they have normal conversations and nothing related to the studies or to the university and all that. I really like to isolate the inspector, and if we get inspected here, I'd like to put them, like, for example, over at a different building and not within the clinic, so they don't have available any clinical stuff, research documents, or anything else. Next slide, please. So the space for the inspector, we have to reserve a conference room, one that's adequate, that can accommodate several people, depending on who's going to be present at the meeting. It should be big enough so the inspector can spread out and the other people can be there during the exit interview. It should be conveniently located. It should not have an available copy machine. If the FDA inspector would like to make copies, they should ask us, and we should make duplicate copies so we can keep a copy of what the inspector is taking. We don't want any other information about studies, medical records, or study documents, binders available for the inspector to look at. The room should have a lock when the inspector leaves the room, or if we have to keep the information there during the inspection. The inspector will have to leave for lunch or bathroom break, so the room has to lock. The inspector usually won't have study teams in the room while they're inspecting. This is very important to understand, that all our documents, regulatory documents, patient records, source documents, backup history, everything that we have to do for clinical trials has to stand on their own without any input from the study team, because usually the inspector will do the study inspection and everything on their own, and then they have a lot of questions. We have to understand that the inspector that's coming is not an expert on this trial. They would have to read the protocol and follow the protocol just like we would do. So let's not make their job a lot easier by pointing things out. And of course, when we select the room, let people understand that might be around the conference room to avoid loud conversations near the inspector, and hopefully the inspector can have peace and quiet. Also, we don't want to become friends with the inspector. We want to show them where the bathroom is, possibly have some water available to them. They do their lunch on their own and everything. They're just here to do an inspection, and that's how we're going to keep it. Next slide, please. So the preparation is, we need to designate a knowledgeable person to oversee the inspection. Within each department, we can have a spokesperson. Usually it could be a supervisor, a lead, or somebody that can knows a lot about the institution and can answer a lot of questions as the spokesperson. Also, we need to review the sponsor's SOPs on the inspection. So when you reach out to the sponsor, they'll provide you some information about the inspection and what they want, but it's also important to review our SOPs and to make sure the investigator understands where they can find the SOPs for our institution. Also, it's recommended that the PI and the study team reviews the study again, because we don't know necessarily when that inspection is going to happen. As you saw previously, we can get a notification 5 years after the study has started, or usually until it gets approved by the FDA, so we have to keep the records for 2 years. We had a case at a vaccine trial. We had a notification of inspection 16 years after the study had started. So it's important to go over the study and make sure that the PI understands and remembers the whole study and what was entailed. Review source documents related to the events that led to the inspection if it was a for cause. So once we understand what the situation is, what they're claiming, we can look at our records and prepare for that. And of course, review the applicable protocols that are going to be inspected, and patients and consents and regulatory documents. Next slide. So the preparation, of course, it ensures subject and regulatory records are completed and audited, inspected, ready. There's some tools that we can use, and if you have any questions, we can provide you with a link, or you can go to the FDA regulated site. It's the Informed Consent Review Worksheet. This usually walks you through what is important to have in the research consent form. So for example, is it the right version? Is it the right consent form? How do we do this? And like I mentioned before, if we have quality management, quality control built into our system, it should be easy to find the latest version of the informed consent without being able to confuse them with previous versions. Also, the highest, most common deficiencies is failure to follow the investigator plan, protocol deviations, inadequate record keeping, inadequate accountability for investigation product, inadequate communication with IRB, and of course, inadequate subject protection. So these are important things that we need to look, and these worksheets will help you see these things. The other worksheet is a subject self-audit worksheet, and of course, the regulatory self-audit worksheet. we do have to understand that the inspection, what the purpose of the routine inspection is to protect the rights, safety, and welfare of subjects that are involved in an FDA-regulated clinical trial. Second is to verify the accuracy and reliability of the clinical study data being submitted to the FDA. And of course, the last one is to assess the compliance with FDA regulations. And when we talked about the SOPs, we want to make sure our SOPs are not more strict than the FDA regulations, because if our SOPs are stricter than the FDA regulations, they will hold us to our SOPs, not to the federal regulations. Another way to prepare is identify any weakness or gaps in the documentation and address as applicable. The correction of errors by lining through the data, initialing data. Developing a plan of the corrective action plan is important. And regardless of the event prompted by the FDA, we'll likely review other related records. So if the FDA comes for a cause audit, they might be looking at other records or other type of charts. So that is very important to remember and to keep in mind, that we have to understand why the inspector is coming to visit us. Next slide. So when the inspector arrives, the important thing is to receive the inspector, ask them for their verification of their ID, look at their credentials. Usually they'll provide us also a business card, so we'll have the name and everything of the inspector. The photocopies that cannot be made of their documents or their credentials, so we have to understand that. The inspector will present us with a 482 form. As soon as they present us with a 482 form, that's when the official inspection will start. The inspection will also explain the intended purpose and scope of the inspection during the interview. And the inspector will ask the PI for a list of currently active studies. So that is basically what we have to make sure the PI understands and what's going to be happening. That's basically it, my part, and next will be Kristen Mahaffey doing her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kristen Mahaffey, and I am the CMS manager here at UW. So as Raphael pointed out, the best thing to do for an FDA inspection is to prepare ahead of time by maintaining inspection-ready files. It would be really nice if we could simply refuse an inspection, but unfortunately, researchers are required to permit the FDA to inspect and copy any and all records pertaining to the investigation, including PHI at no charge. So whenever making copies for an investigator, we always recommend to also make a copy for your files as well. We want to have that documentation of everything that they asked, everything they looked at, for future reference after the inspection happens. Typically, the inspector will request the standard study documents. That includes regulatory, essential documents, the original signed informed consent forms, any source documentation, case report forms, etc. Sometimes they also request quality documents such as our SOPs and the manual of procedures. It is important to note at this point, like Raphael also stated, preparation phase is over. The study documents at this point stand on their own. The inspector is not going to wait while documents are being added or corrected in the midst of inspection. And even if you do that, those items will likely still turn up on a list of deficiencies at the end of inspection. Also important to point out, delays in providing any of that requested information that the inspector requests, it will demonstrate an overall lack of organization, or could raise suspicion that the study team is trying to hide something. So again, preparation ahead of time is the key to success during inspection. And most importantly, only provide what the inspector requests. Don't give them an excuse to find more and go down other rabbit holes. I once had a study where I was reviewing, the study team didn't prepare all the documents ahead of time. They set me loose in their room with a room full of binders of all their studies, all their subjects. Do not do that for an inspector. We don't want to give them any access to other PHI that they don't need. Next slide, please. Generally, inspectors do not request to review the following documents: finance records, that includes your budget, contract, CDA, etc., and study personnel records, except for those documents that support documentation of training, education, and experience. They also don't request our internal audit records. So part of my job is to perform routine reviews here at UW. And those reviews are a specific institutional requirement. The findings within those reviews are not discoverable by the FDA. So in those cases, I recommend keeping a separate binder for those types of internal audits. However, internal audit records do differ from routine monitoring records, and monitoring is a requirement of the FDA, and those records do need to be maintained in the study binder, and that includes your confirmation notices, any monitoring reports, etc. Next slide, please. So even though inspectors can request copies of PHI, we should be asking them if it's okay to redact participant identifiers on what we provide in case it isn't necessary. We still want to go in with the HIPAA mentality of protecting that information. And sometimes the FDA announces they're coming and there isn't always time to process access requests to their EMR. So over-the-shoulder EMR access is permissible, and it could actually be best practice because it could ensure the inspector is with a member of the study team to ask questions in real time. But ultimately, that really does depend on the preference of the inspector. In addition, the PI should set aside time each day during the inspection to meet with the inspector, and some member of the study team should be available at all times during the inspection for any questions that may arise. Next slide, please. So when answering an inspector's question, like I stated before, it's very important to keep a log of all questions asked and answered. We want to listen carefully to each question and ask for clarification. If you don't understand the question the inspector asks, don't try and guess. Be truthful, don't make anything up. Be concise, stop talking once you've answered the question. And answer only the questions you are asked. As stated before, only provide requested information, don't offer up anymore. Do not speculate or guess. If you don't know the answer, tell them, write it down, and find someone who does. For example, if you're asked an IRB question and you don't do the IRB submissions on the study, and that's not your role, ask the expert, ask the delegated regulatory personnel to help you answer that question. And do not argue with the inspector. Unfortunately, in the eyes of an inspector, if there isn't documentation to support it, it didn't happen. Next slide, please. So I've compiled a list of our common mistakes we see out in the field as monitors. Inadequate documentation of informed consent, and that includes the incorrect version of the informed consent was signed. So make sure to always use the most up-to-date IRB stamped informed consent. I typically recommend that study teams pull directly from the IRB system for that. A lot of times, you know, the study team will print out copies and have them on file. And then, you know, if a protocol amendment happens, they pull the wrong consent form. So to eliminate that, just always pull directly from the IRB system. We see a lack of reconsent. A lack of documentation of the informed consent process, showing that the subject had adequate time to review the consent or ask any questions. And we see inadequate baseline medical history to determine eligibility. I have seen this, especially when participants come from outside of our clinics. Sometimes the medical records collected from outside facilities don't include all the information to determine that eligibility. So be sure that if you are getting EMR from the outside, that it does have enough information to verify the subject is in fact eligible. Sometimes within the files, documentation methods differ from participant to participant. For example, you know, a study might start out with paper and then transition to electronic data capture. Or sometimes throughout the study, the CRF forms get changed and there's different forms for the same visit. This can kind of make a study appear sloppy or disorganized and also leaves room for multiple errors. Another common finding we see is a lack of updated regulatory documents. And that includes the delegation log, staff training records, as well as any updated CVs or licenses. Slide 6, or sorry, the next slide, please. Some more common mistakes. Inadequate supervision and training of study staff. Every time there's a substantial protocol amendment, there should be documentation that applicable study staff was trained. I see that all the time where, a protocol amendment comes out, staff wasn't notified, and the old protocol was still followed because they weren't trained on the new procedures. So that's very important. We see insufficient study investigator involvement in study conduct. As a reminder, the principal investigator can delegate any task except for overall responsibility of the study. We see inappropriate delegation of study tasks to unqualified personnel, failure to adequately protect subjects, and an overworked investigator and study staff. For example, too many studies, a complex study with a large amount of data, and too many concurrent studies. I really recommend that protocols are written in a way that enable the investigator to have success. So only collect data points that are necessary. If the protocol states that something will be collected, anytime it's not collected, it's considered a deviation. Also, write in windows for study visits. If the protocol states scan every 3 months, everything outside of exactly 3 months is a deviation. So be generous with yourself and allow protocol windows if it is safe for the subject. And then there is some guidance tools below, a link to that. And with that actually ends my presentation. And I will turn it over to Jill Kubiak.
Thank you, Kristen. So I'm going to talk about kind of the wrap up of the inspection as well as what will happen following the inspection. At the end, you should have an exit interview or an outgoing meeting, terminology TBD on that, but if the inspector doesn't initiate an exit interview, the PI should ask for one. Please do include the FDA regulated research oversight program. I'm going to call them the program for the rest of my slides because that's a mouthful. You can use the notification email that was earlier on in the slides to let them know the date and time, location, etc. of the exit interview. It's really important to take notes during the exit interview. Very often, the inspector will go over not only any serious regulatory deficiencies that they may have identified, but they may also make suggestions on ways to improve existing processes and communicate best practices more generally. So having those notes can really help for later reflection so that you can make improvements. If a serious regulatory deficiency is found during the inspection, they will provide you with a 483. I haven't seen this happen in any of the inspections I've been a part of, but basically if the inspector gives you something to sign, it's a good idea to consult with UW legal team prior to doing so. Next slide. Now we're going to shift gears out of the inspection and we're gonna talk about post-inspection. So after you've had a time to take a deep breath and congratulate yourself on making it through an FDA inspection, these are some steps that you'll want to take. It's a really good idea to write up a summary of the inspection from all of the notes that were taken throughout. Kristen mentioned the importance of taking notes during the inspection. Raphael mentioned the kind of the notes you would want to take when you're notified of the inspection. Also, those notes from your exit interview should all be collated. And if the inspector did visit pharmacy, pharmacy may have some notes to provide as well. Kind of collating all of that really helps to have an overall, it tells the story of the inspection overall. If a form FDA 483 was issued, the PI is responsible for sending a written response back to FDA within 15 working days. The FDA's official stance on responding to 483s is that it's optional, but recommended. As an institution, we take the stance that it's a requirement. So all PIs should be responding to 483s that are issued. The response will include the following elements. Basically, you'll repeat any observations and then you'll follow that with a response. If you disagree with an observation, you can respond factually by providing clear and verifiable evidence. It's also an important step when actually drafting the response to determine if the observations noted were one-time occurrences or systemic issues. because making that distinction and having that understanding will help you outline corrective and preventive actions as needed, which is that response piece. I did want to note here that the 483 is not a final determination by the FDA. I'm actually going to talk about final determinations, I think 2 slides from now, so we have that to look forward to. Outside of the response itself, you will want to think about whether any observations that you received apply to other studies that weren't inspected or just your broader processes. For example, if you received a deficiency related to delegation of authority, you want to look at your delegation of authority SOP and see if that SOP, those procedures need to be updated to get everything in alignment. And you also want to think about how a change to that SOP and that identified deficiency affect other studies that weren't inspected. Next slide. You want to make sure that you keep copies of your 483 and the response that was provided to the FDA. The program also needs to receive a copy of the 483 as well as the response. The guidance that is linked on this slide is, it helps you to answer industry sponsor requests for 483s. It has some helpful information in it pertaining to the fact that our IRB has been inspected and has not received any 483s. It talks about the sharing of 483s when requested by industry sponsors, specifically that investigators can only share their own 483s. It also has information that's really helpful about redaction. Basically, the program will provide you with a redacted copy of the 483 as well as any associated materials, including the response, so that when you, in the event that you do need to share it, all of the sensitive, confidential, proprietary, et cetera, information has been removed. You also want to make sure that you report the inspection findings in response to applicable parties, including the IRBs, sponsors, and if it's a cancer center study, our DSMC. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to move into we're almost at the final determination piece here, but before that, the FDA will issue an establishment inspection report, or EIR. This report contains both the 483 observations and any findings that were not serious deficiencies. So those process improvement or best practice discussions that were talked about in the outgoing meeting will be reflected in the report. It's a bigger picture document than just the 483. The EIR 483 supporting evidence collected during the inspection and the response that was sent to FDA are reviewed by FDA to make their final determination. The final determination will fall into one of these categories: no action indicated, the one we're all hoping for, voluntary action indicated, or official action indicated. That last one, official action indicated, can include warning letters or taking actions to disqualify investigators. So basically, we're through the inspection process. We've done some post-inspection activities, and now there's an opportunity for folks to ask questions. And I've provided our contact information here if you have questions later. These slides these last 2 slides will be provided to you. The font is very tiny. They won't be read out loud here at the meeting. Instead, they are for your reference because they are sample questions that FDA inspectors have asked during initial meetings.
Thanks, Jill. Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, I haven't seen any questions pop up in chat yet, but if you have any, please do add them to the chat. Just want to kick it off with an initial question, which I think could be answered by any of you. What are the most common findings that come from an FDA inspection?
You want to take it, Kristen?
I can answer that one, unless you wanted to, Kristen. By the mute, I'm going to say, okay, sounds good. I did actually note them. I have them on my other screen here, so I'm going to look to that screen for reference. I looked at the 2022 most common inspection findings in preparation for this discussion, and noted that these have actually stayed the top three over several years. The first one is an investigation was not conducted in accordance with the signed statement of investigator or the 1572 or the protocol. The next one is failure to prepare or maintain adequate or accurate case histories with respect to observations and data pertinent to the investigation and or informed consent. And then lastly, investigational drug disposition records are not adequate with respect to dates, quantities, or use by subjects.
I think it's also important to mention that before the inspector comes to do an audit here or an inspection at UW, they will look into their files and see if we've received any previous 483s, and they will come to inspect if we've done any changes in the past. So they look at all the inspections they've done in the past before they come out also. Not just for that investigator, but for any investigator or any department.
Thanks. We had a question, actually a couple of questions that popped up here. What should we do if an FDA agent just shows up at our site?
Usually what we'll do is, with respect and everything, we'll receive them, we'll understand why they're here. They'll present us the reason of the inspection. Most of the time we can delay the visit saying that the PI is not available, we don't have things ready, and we can delay, I've been able to delay it for a week more or less, the inspection. It depends, because when it's for a for-cause audit, they should have access immediately. So it depends on if it's a routine, we can delay it.
Okay, and then Raphael, you mentioned SOPs should reflect FDA guidance and not more than that. Amy is wondering how possible that is, given that other guidelines and policies apply to our processes too.
What I was referring to is the FDA already has FDA regulations about informed consent, study management, record keeping. Our SOP should be how do those policies or regulations get executed within UW, but don't make it more stricter what the FDA is saying. What we can have is a complement to those SOPs are guidelines that we can change. I've seen SOPs here that have people's names on it. So when that person leaves, we're in violation of the SOP because that person's no longer here. So our SOPs is just a reflection of the federal regulations of how they get executed within UW, and then the details of how we do that can be in a guideline.
Thanks, Raphael. A question for Jill. What is an FDA 483 and a 1572?
Fantastic question. So 483 is what you would receive at the end of an inspection if there were serious regulatory deficiencies identified by the inspector. And then a 1572 is a statement of agreement from the investigator about how they will conduct the study. It's an official FDA form as well. It is a place to kind of collate a bunch of information about the study, who the IRB of record is, which labs will be used, who sub-investigators are, et cetera. And then there are some agreements at the end of the form. I think there's 9 of them that the investigators agree to follow by signing the 1572. And it comes down to things like we'll follow the regulations pertaining to the conduct of the study. And also I will inform my colleagues who are involved in the study on how to do things related to the study. And I will follow the protocol, that type of stuff.
And there's an additional form that's the 484, and it's the receipt of samples. It's really rare to have that, but if the inspector wants to take IP or sample of the study medication, they have to sign it out, and they'll give you a 484 if they take the sample with them.
Another question here. What is your experience if the inspectors find significant deficiencies early on? How did they share that info? And how does the inspection, what is the tone of the inspection? How does the inspection proceed?
Well, the inspection will proceed. Normally, what it could happen is the amount of days might get extended, they might have to revisit, or like I said, they might schedule a compliance follow-up inspection to see if we've corrected those deficiencies. The problem is that during the inspection, if there's a serious findings, they can ask for more records or expand their scope of their inspection. So it can turn from a routine inspection to a for cause or more findings of other documents.
And thanks, Raphael. Another question, beyond the great information and tips in this talk, are the presenters aware of other trainings / resources for study teams to prepare and practice for FDA inspections and audits?
Yeah, actually, there's a research toolkit that has actually all of my checklists as a monitor. So study teams, that's available to study teams to use so that they can audit their own studies at any time.
And I think it's also important to follow good clinical practice. And should be our standard. And it doesn't matter what trial it is, if it's an investigator initiated, an NIH, or a pharmaceutical trial. If we treat all the studies the same way with the same high standard of good clinical practice, we should be doing everything correctly. And especially introducing, like I said, quality management within our systems and things like that, that can prevent us from being reactive and mostly proactive of an inspection. I like to consider that all studies should be ready for inspection at any moment. And of course, that includes, don't do what I do, or, do what I say. Don't wait until the last minute to file documents. Do data capturing immediately. Don't wait several weeks to put from the source document to the case report forms. That keeps you online, and you can find more discrepancies, and it's easier to ask the PI or the doctor if you're missing some information immediately instead of waiting a couple of weeks.
Okay, we've got a few more coming in here. Do we have any institutional SOPs, or are they specific to each department within UW?
That's a great question. We are trying to standardize SOPs across UW. That's a big endeavor that we're taking on, but there are some institutional policies. We're also looking at combining or working with UW Health to have the same type of SOPs that we have. And hopefully the departments that have SOPs are standardized across the board. So that's what we're working on. So we don't have different SOPs in each department, and one department can be held to another department's SOPs. So we're working on standardizing SOPs basically.
Do you recommend sites or teams doing mock FDA audits?
Absolutely. Within the study team, what we can do is, most studies have a backup coordinator. And what I recommend is when you get your first patient enrolled, have that backup coordinator check the enrollment, the eligibility, see if the checklist, the source documents are created correctly. Usually it takes up to the third patient that you enroll to get your source documents the way you want them. So sometimes what I also do is, if within the group of study coordinators, if somebody has some downtime, I ask them to review somebody else's study. It's easier to find mistakes in other people's studies than in your own, because you have everything in your head and you think you've done it. So that's a great suggestion that you do internally. And it doesn't take that much time. It just has to be one patient.